Sure, thank you for serving as moderator, and I will be on the chat and here supporting Mike.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to welcome everyone to this panel, the World Organized Labor and Criminal Justice Reform. We don't have much time today, so what I'm going to do is just mention all of our great panelists and their titles, and then their bios are in the packets, and I wish I could have time to go deeper into each one of their bios because they're great panelists. But for sake of time, I'm just going to introduce each one, and then we can get started. I can begin by asking a question, and we can do an engagement with one another as well. The first, I want to introduce them. Michelle Quensil is the political director for the New York State Nurses Association. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us. Hugo Soto Martinez, a great friend and colleague, is the organizer for Unite HOA Local 11 here in Los Angeles. Thank you, Hugo. Andres Kwan is the policy counsel and senior organizer for the ACLU of Southern California. Thank you for joining us, Andres. Mike Jimenez is the president emeritus for the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. Thank you again, Mike, for joining us. And my hope is you can figure out the issue with the mic. It would be great for you to be able to join us. So thank you all for joining. And my first question, this is a panel about, it's an issue that's become a major topic in the labor movement. The issue of criminal justice as it relates to issues relating to law enforcement, police violence, police abuse, and the issue of police unions, or officers, sheriff's officers unions, or law enforcement officers unions, and it's coming up a lot in my work at the Labor Center, working with the labor movement, and a lot of my work with criminal justice activists. And so my first question to the panelists, and now I can try to facilitate the dialogue. But my first question is, what has been your experience within the context of working with criminal justice advocates, including reform justice advocates, to collaborate with labor leaders in reforming the systems as it addresses police abuse, or really shifting government resources away from law enforcement and prisons to the needs of society, like schools and access to housing and good jobs. So what your experience in this area, and what kind of work are you doing right now to address these issues? And I want to turn it over. Maybe Michelle, you can start.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I think it's a super important question. I'm currently the political director for the New York State Nurses Association, so representing just over 40,000 nurses throughout New York. But just previously, so just over a year ago, I was working at an organization called Open Philanthropy, where I was funding criminal justice reform work. So I feel like my worlds are colliding sort of in this panel. But so both in my prior role and in my current role, I think the experience it's been interesting, and I think it hasn't been uniform, right? I feel like there hasn't been kind of a sort of blanket way that each union responds. Each union that I've worked with, or any sort of worker organization, kind of comes at the issue differently, right? Whether it's working with an organization where a lot of their members could be directly impacted, right? Or either have family members who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, or folks who work in the systems themselves, or even, for example, with my union right now, a lot of our nurse members being frontline workers, being sort of like that kind of essential first responders kind of group, they do feel a certain amount of almost kinship with a lot of law enforcement, have a lot of law enforcement in their family. It's also sort of, I think, that level of like a solid union job, especially in like New York and the city and stuff like that. It's just a union job. And so there's like, I think a sort of just a culture around that. But I think the way I've come at it is being able to think both through the self-interest of workers themselves, but then also thinking beyond that to like the broader community. So what are the needs of workers within a sector and industry, but then how does that relate to the needs of your broader community? I think often we might think very narrowly of what is the sort of short-sighted benefit to workers right now, but if it's I think we can afford to think more long term, like do these sort of short-sighted gains, even for workers within this system, lead to larger gains for our community? And that's a tough question to answer, but I think it's one that we have to ask, right? So if it's, something where we're trying to improve the working conditions, et cetera, or sort of build out even a carceral system because we have good jobs within that system, is that better in the long run for our communities that might be disproportionately impacted by incarceration? Again, tough question, but I think we have to answer that.
Thank you so much. I think your answer, your response kind of sets the framework for the dialogue. So thank you so much, Michelle. Ugo, do you want to go next? I know you've been doing a lot of work. Your union has been really doing great work of being intersectional, especially with issues relating to criminal justice here in Los Angeles. And do you want to address that question?
Sure. Thank you, Victor. So Ugo, lead organizer with Unite Here Local 11, doing a lot of work to in this issue. This is a great question, I think, for the labor movement to sort of ponder and think about, right, as we're moving forward. I would say that this is an emerging conversation that is happening in the labor movement. It is rather new. As coming from a labor background, someone who came from the rank and file is, I think we're taught very and very correctly, right, to think about how do we grow the union? How do we grow the union? And it is true, right? As a labor organizer, I believe that the vehicle that I've chosen is worker organizing. And so when you bring in a subject such as this, when you talk about police abuse, shifting resources, it can be very contentious, right? It can be very contentious. Involves public sector unions who might be affected by it, and then other unions who perhaps are not in the public sector but are focusing directly on the issues of their industry. I think what we have found is that we have to see the world in a more intersectional way, and I sort of take the cue from a lot of labor unions work that they did around immigration in the late 80s and the early 90s. As some folks might recall, right, the AFL-CIO National was adamantly against immigration reform. And it took unions such as SEIU and ourselves to really say, well, our members are Latinx. How does immigration issue affect them? And how in turn can that also help grow the union? And I think we've seen that was the right decision in the late 80s and early 90s, where if you look at the studies, right, California is one of the states that has grown very much so in the union density, and only rivaled by my colleagues here in New York, because I think these issues really were connected. And so, and in turn has changed the Democratic Party and the policies that emerge nationally. And so we know that when we go against the current, sometimes it might be unpopular at the beginning, but in the future, we know that the outcome will be a positive one. And so I think right now we're looking at it as a very long-term goal. We know that we are obviously in the minority in these issues, but I firmly believe that the history is on our side. And so I think we got to continue to talk about it, engage, especially those public sector unions who could be, or not the most affected by this, and bring them in, because I do think there is a gap that is happening right now between the grassroots and the labor. And so someone who sort of straddles both worlds, I take it upon myself to really try to bridge those worlds and be as forward-looking as possible. So it'll take some time, it'll take a lot of dialogue, but I do think that we're sort of in a moment in time where these issues are the right ones to fight.
Thank you, Hugo. Andres, working at the Southern California of the ACLU chapter, Southern California chapter, what has been your role in this issue? I know you come, for the perspective of civil rights and constitutional rights, but what has been your work in this area, especially as it relates to the labor movement?
Yeah, thanks, Victor, and thanks everyone. I'm going to try to use LA sort of as a microcosm, and the work that we've been doing here, especially through the Check the Sheriff Coalition, that's been a intersectional coalition that's been around for a couple of years since the current sheriff, Alex Villanueva, whom people call the Trump of LA, of LA law enforcement, was elected in November 2018. And I think what Hugo said about intersectionality is really, really important. Villanueva, again, the Trump of LA, was elected primarily because of his big promise to kick ICE out of the jails here in LA County. LA County, folks may not know, is in terms of population, if it was its own state, it'd be the 9th, 10th biggest state in the country with more than 10 million people just in the county. And the jails here are the largest in the country. And the LA County Sheriff's Department transferred more people to ICE, to immigration, than any other state except for the state of Texas for a long time. So that's the legacy of the LA County Sheriff's Department. And the sheriff was always in cahoots with ICE and with federal immigration. After Trump's election, there was a lot of efforts to pass sanctuary policies, even at the state level. And the former sheriff really fought that tooth and nail. And the immigrants' rights movement here was really up in arms about that. And when Villanueva came in and promised to kick ICE out of the jails, a lot of the progressive folks, immigrants' rights folks, endorsed him, pushed for him to be elected. And he eked out a win by like a marginal win, 1,000+ votes. Historic in that never had an incumbent sheriff lost in at least 100 years. What he did after, though, he really pulled a bait and switch where he prohibited ICE agents with the ICE jacket from coming in, but then he allowed private contractors working for ICE to come in and pick our people up and take them away to ICE detention. So basically, business as usual. Now, because of that issue, a lot of immigrants' rights folks and a lot of unions too, that, it was a long time in the making, 20, 30 years ago, for them to come around and push for immigration reform and stand up for immigrants' rights. And they care about immigrants' rights. They sided with Villanueva, with the current sheriff, over that issue, sort of dismissing, maybe not dismissing, but prioritizing that issue over the killing of people. The sheriff's department has killed at least 18 community members, Angelenos, since the public execution of George Floyd, all but 2 Black and Latinx in Black and Latinx areas. There have been deputy gangs that this sheriff has continued to enable. Just Google deputy gangs, LASD gangs. You'll read a lot about it, a lot of articles about it. And then he's really allowed the systematic harassment by sheriff's deputies of the families of people they've killed, who dare speak and exercise their First Amendment rights. So that intersectionality is really critical, that lens. And it's been hard to get more unions involved in the Check the Sheriff Coalition. Unite Here, Local 11, joined their efforts to check the sheriff, check Villanueva, because one of their members, longtime members, son was killed last summer by the sheriff's department, and in particular by a prospect of one of these deputy gangs, the so-called executioners in the Compton station. And so I'm really hoping that unions that are primarily made up of and comprised of people of color, Black, Latinx members, who are very much impacted by policies at the sheriff's department, will see the light, will get past their constraints or what they perceive as political constraints, and join what the community has been echoing in a community groundswell for Villanueva's resignation and for structural change of the Sheriff's Department.
Thank you so much. I would say we're not going to benefit from Mike's voice, but we have a great backup for Mike and Sonia. So, and they've been communicating. So you can address Mike's response, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victor. So if everyone can be on mute. Mike, you ready? Go for it.
Okay. I will try to not make this too painful for you. My vision of this is the intersectionality that I have an interest in, or that I want to speak to, is the minority communities have found, at least in the union I represented, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, minority communities found an opportunity to get out of low-paying jobs into state jobs with retirement, with opportunities to promote, with future, and they were law enforcement jobs. And part of the problem that I experienced is that once minority communities move into that environment, they become more of the environment than the community that they came from. And I don't mean to say that everybody forgets about where they came from. It's not that way at all. It's a much more subtle transition into becoming, into the opportunity. It's viewed as an opportunity, and it's something that you become. Part of the problem with regard to changing the dynamic that currently exists in criminal justice and minority communities and how they relate to one another is that because minority communities are relatively recent in the influx of those good jobs, that the way unions generally work is those minority communities will also be the first ones cut if those law enforcement jobs or those union jobs no longer exist. So I think we're in a very interesting point in history right now. I think that we've got an opportunity to embrace the change that needs to occur and that I think is occurring. We're going to, our shortcoming is going to be that we're settling for what things should be instead of trying to reimagining how things could be. And every one of these prisons, rather than being a white elephant to something of the past, I think they should be opportunities, or we should change them into opportunities for people to change their lives and to do something for the future. The process that's been going on in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is anything but rehabilitation and corrections. And it's been that way for some time. I didn't view my role while I was president as having what I believe now the role of that job is, and that is representing the community of California more than just the officers of the prison system. In doing so, I think that you advantage everybody that works in the prison system by making the state of California and as such, the environment they work in better. Like I said, the challenge is going to be in reimagining what those correctional officers and even police officers could be at this point in time, taking an opportunity to move from being a historical prison guard, correctional officer now, into being a community service officer, or into being something different, but yet still being a state or a government employee with a blue-collar job that gives you an opportunity to live in the community where you work, to put your kids through college, to have health care, and to be able to retire and to spend time with your grandchildren as you grow old. That was what I pushed for as president of CCPOA, and I think those things are still available, but we need to have a reimagination of how the unions interact with not only the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, but also with the communities that the members come out of. And I don't want to be real critical of anybody that's currently there, but I think it requires a great imagination to be able to move this ball forward. And if we stop with what things should be, like I said, if we just imagine that, and instead of what things could be, we will never get to where they should be because we'll settle for what they are. And I'm looking forward to participating in this discussion and being a part of changing that dynamic. And if I can be of more assistance, please don't hesitate to ask me.
Thank you so much.
It's been such a pain. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. You actually led me to my next question, and then I'll throw this question out to the panelists, and you can all chime in, or whoever wants to answer first. But I've been doing some research in preparation for this panel. 80% of law enforcement officers are unionized in this country. It's a high union density. Many are affiliated with the AFL-CIO through the International Union of Police Associations. Many are affiliated with the Teamsters because the Teamsters is not part of the AFL-CIO. And many of them are independent unions. They're not affiliated with the AFL-CIO or the Teamsters. Throughout the country, and then I've been researching different efforts throughout the country on how to deal with the issue of police unions. Is it, dealing with the, when it relates to reimagining public safety, reimagining criminal justice, creating accountability, transparency. In some cities, they're looking at maybe the collective bargaining agreements. Like we know that, unions have to represent their members for wages and benefits, really working conditions, but maybe collective bargaining agreements can be limited as far as it deals with issues of, reforms and accountability, transparency, discipline, process for police officers. Other states are looking more at policy. They, some statutes, they call them law enforcement bill of rights, which, through policy, they kind of legislate the rights the police officer feels like they have as far as going through a process of discipline and a process of, addressing abuse and police reform issues. Some cities, the public entities, the local governments are getting more involved and saying, no, we allow the police union to exist, but we need to create a system that involves the public, involves transparency and accountability, so they get more involved in creating the framework for addressing issues of police abuse and issues of criminal justice. Everybody's trying different models. So my question to the panelists is, from my work with the labor movement, I totally understand that unions are there to serve the working conditions of their members, especially as it relates to wages and benefits. But what is it about police unions in the context of today's struggle for criminal justice? What is it? How do we deal with this dynamic? We have police unions throughout the country. Just about every law enforcement officer belongs to a police union. And how do we deal with this either through the labor movement or through the criminal justice movement as we move towards a reimagining of public safety? So I'm throwing this out there and see who wants to answer that question first. So take it on. Oh, Andres, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question. I've been trying to use LA as a microcosm, and in LA, the project, first, the city of angels, so to speak, it's really better defined as city of inmates. There's a book by Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez that I'll recommend everyone. The LA County is the carceral capital of the world. And the legacy of that, goes all the way back to Spanish conquest, and then U.S. Manifest Destiny. The first government building in LA was a jail. And then not only is law enforcement and the sheriff's department the enforcers of that, but also the enforcers of capitalism and the capitalist project, right? I mean, we know that, how the ACLU SoCal, the second affiliate of the ACLU National that was formed in New York, we came about after dock workers were striking in 1923. And Upton Sinclair, the writer and labor activist Upton Sinclair, came and support, in support of the dock workers, and started reading the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. And the LAPD came out and they weren't too happy about it. And they basically told them, quote, cut out the Constitution stuff. And then they proceeded to arrest him and held him overnight incommunicado for 18 hours. He didn't even finish reading the Bill of Rights, and they arrested him. And after that, he founded the ACLU SoCal, after the LAPD suppressed the constitutional rights of labor organizers, of people daring to speak, assemble, protest, organize. And that legacy has continued all the way to the present. So police, and their employees, officers, and then the unions, and not just the unions, but really what I call the police lobby. They're not real labor unions, right? I mean, when I think about a labor union, I think about solidarity. I think about, I'm in a union now. We're just forming a union right now at ACLU SoCal, right? But police unions are really, I think what we need to think about is the police lobby. And that includes police associations, including the LAPPL, here with the LAPD Officers Union, and then the ALATs, the Sheriff's Deputy Lobby here. They're multi-million-dollar political action committees. They're lobbying organizations like PORAC, and the entire corporate policing industry, including companies like Lexipol, Force Science Institute, that make their money selling policy and training to police departments. And they fought tooth and nail across California and the country. They've been special interests. They fought tooth and nail any inkling, any minimal reform for police accountability and transparency. And, the community has been calling this out and fighting this, and other labor unions that are especially made up of predominantly of Black and brown folks need to be, holding them accountable as well.
I'll go to Ugo, and then next, and then.
Yeah, again, thank you for this. You're asking some pretty challenging questions, Victor. I appreciate that. I think from a labor perspective, I think the one important detail that needs to be globally understood is how labor unions have been completely eviscerated, right, from the public discussion of our abilities to engage. We know that public and private sector unions used to be about 30% of the density in the 60s, right? Private union density is now less than 7%. And the one place where there's still a bastion of support is public sector unions. They're still about 30%. And so now this isn't an old history. It's recent history. This happened during the 80s and the 90s, and many of the labor leaders that are still there now, that experienced this just completely being gutted, right? There are people in Unite Here who still remember that, right? And how we've had to claw back and fight back. And really many unions did not survive. And so, and the most recent iterations of this was Governor Walker in Wisconsin, which essentially destroyed public sector unions, right? And so I think when we talk about police unions and their role, and whether they should exist or not, I think that we have to understand that is a real and palpable fear that the right wing has done in destroying labor unions. However, I think we also, and again, this is an emerging dialogue, right? And so I might not have the right answers and I might get pushed in the future. So take it into context, right? However, I think we're also looking at how do we invest our tax dollars, right? We know that the LAPD is $3 billion in Los Angeles, almost 1/2 of the entire discretionary funds And so Unite Here was very happy to support the people's budget last year, because what we're really discussing is how do we address the ills of our society, right? Do we want to continue policing our problems, right? And I think the emerging conversation is that we don't. We don't want to police our issues of society. And so we know that police don't stop crime. They show up after it happens, right? We know that most of the calls that police deal with are not violent crimes. They're just issues, right? And so there's been tons of articles about police being trained to be these like warriors and soldiers, but then they end up doing essentially what a social worker does, right? Dealing with issues that are not about crime, but rather are the issues that have come up from a state that starves our community of resources, of opportunities, of social programs that that need to be addressed. And so I think those conversations are coming out, and I think the most important thing as an ardent labor leader for the last 15 years is that we have to engage the public sector unions, right? Because they have to be part of this process. And it's very similar to the Green New Deal, which I won't get into, but it's a similar conversation, right? It's like, how do we engage those unions in this transition to make sure that in the process, we don't, throw out the baby with the bathwater and inadvertently hurt the labor movement, right? So those conversations have to happen. But again, these are very emerging and very new. But I think I'm very proud to say that Unite Here is taking the leadership on this, right? And so we'll continue to do so, but we got to keep talking about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and then if Michelle, she wants to respond. Mike? So.
I couldn't agree more. This is an emerging discussion that has to happen. Part of the problem with law enforcement and labor unions, and having represented one for 20 years, I understand that mentality, and some of that mentality is that the outside world doesn't understand what it takes to do our job. You made a reference to it when you said we train these people to be warriors and then we ask them to go do social work. Well, that dynamic also exists inside the union about nobody understands what's going on outside of our little group here. And it becomes an us against them, even if that's not the way it's set up to be. And I'm going to use an example of a guy named Pat Lynch out of the New York City Police Department. He's the union president out there. And during the presidential election, and I have feelings about that, but I'm not going to go into it today, he was on the side of Donald Trump, but what he said was, everybody needs to get out of our road and let police do the job that they know how to do. And that's the dynamic that's got to change, is these unions, many of them are not seeing what the community is asking them to do. We don't want warriors showing up at our house. If I'm having a domestic dispute with one of my children or my wife, I don't want any of them ending up dead under any circumstances. That's not what I called for. I don't want a warrior. And the way you've been doing things recently, at least in the police departments that have been televised, is not the right way to play out. Every one of these incidents that we've seen recently on TV could have played out differently, whether it was a young girl being shot or whether it was an unarmed man being shot. And some of those things that need to play out differently the way we get into play out differently is we get a different mentality showing up. And that is the mentality that we want everybody to go home safely, not just the people that wear blue or green. Our community is what matters. And I'm going to use one last statistic to give you an example of how I think that officers don't realize how much they're responsible for other people's health and welfare, not just their own. 57% of all of the correctional officers in California have refused to get the coronavirus vaccine. Now, I don't know where the department's going on, and I don't know where the union's going on, but I read that in Cal Matters yesterday, and it shocked me that that many people don't have any concept whatsoever that it's not about themselves or their individual liberties. It's about what they owe to their community, to their duty to their job and their responsibility to the department that they swore to give their life to if necessary in the line of duty. If you're willing to give your life in the line of duty, you ought to be willing to get a shot. You ought to be willing to take care of people that need your help. You ought to be willing to tell other people that they're behaving badly. I believe in all of those things, and that's unfortunately one of the reasons I don't fit in much anymore. So I'll leave you with that, Michelle, please.
Thank you, Mike. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, so much great stuff coming up. And obviously, this is an emerging discussion. But one of the things that you brought up, Mike, around sort of this like us against the world sort of mentality, which is kind of scary considering what the job should be, like to serve and protect. But if you're thinking it's like it's us against the world, that's kind of horrifying. But I think what's interesting about that is that also probably has some impact on why this industry is so highly unionized, right? Like, their density is so high. You don't go to a shop and there are people who are like, I'm not in the union, right? Whereas we all know as union organizers have dealt with other shops where you're like really trying to get people to make sure they're on cards and make sure they're in the union, where you don't necessarily have that. You have very high density in law enforcement. And I think some of it does come from that, no one else can do our job. Nobody understands us. It's us against the world. And this is our organization that protects us from everyone else. So that's part of it. But I think rather, and sometimes I get nervous around the conversations of people wanting to go after public sector unions or go after police unions, because I don't know if it's necessarily labor inherently or the union inherently that is the issue here. Where with policing, there's so many structural issues with policing where, the union is I don't want to say parasite, but it feeds off of the structural issues with policing, where their scope is so far reaching. Police can sort of take on all sorts of situations that they probably have no business being a part of, right? And so obviously those organizations, when they're protecting or bargaining on behalf of these workers, when you have this far-reaching broad scope that is unchecked structurally, I mean, like, I'm not surprised that the police unions are so powerful or manage to have these collective bargaining agreements where people can kill without impunity. I've represented public employees before. We didn't have contracts where you could just kill people and not be held accountable. We still had accountability structures within our contracts, but only when you go to a job that is so structurally sort of closed off from accountability, then yeah, their union's going to be able to rely on. So I mean, I think that's something that I've been sort of struggling with, where it's how can we take on policing as an institution, as a structure that has real issues with it, versus just saying the police union, like if we deal with the police union, then we'll fix policing, because I don't think that's necessarily true.
I think it's a real struggle, because the police lobby that I talked about has tried to maintain the status quo, right, and just double down on it, despite growing, again, emerging conversations, but a growing realization that we need to reimagine what public safety means, and we need to create alternatives to incarceration, to policing, and really what it comes down to it, as Mike and Hugo mentioned too, is creating real, well-paying jobs with living wages that are unionized, including the public sector, especially. And in the public sector, talking about that, we're talking about jobs, professions that are life-giving, right? Health, education, etc. But when it comes to policing, especially with the legacy, the origins and legacy of policing in this country, we really have to reimagine public safety, policing, reduce the footprint of the carceral state policing, and instead creating public sector jobs that are life-giving, that address some of the more root causes that lead to, whether it be violence or, in particular, minor crimes, non-violent, non-serious, really crimes of survival. Here in LA, what was criminalized? Street vending for a while, for a long time. And immigrants in particular were being funneled into the deportation pipeline for that. The city attorney, the LAPD were going after street vendors. And we've worked to criminalize that over the years. And Victor Narro actually has been leading, part of leading that effort. So we need to be, that's just one example of what we need to be doing going forward.
Okay, that kind of leads me that's a good segue to the question from Cynthia in the chat box. I'm going to read the question out loud, and again, any of the panelists can respond. Since prisons create exploitative labor conditions where workers receive little pay, how can labor stand in solidarity with incarcerated workers? Could labor benefit from an end to the prison systems and low wages? So we're talking about the issue of the prison system and incarceration, how that leads to really communities being harmed as far as access to opportunities and good paying jobs after they have served in the incarcerated system.
I'll just answer real quick by saying that the explosion of the carceral system over the last few decades, mass incarceration, has not only kept people inside, but also the collateral consequences of having arrests or convictions on your record and your ability to get employed going forward, of getting professional licensing, etc. A lot of folks have been just cut at the knees, so to speak, when it comes to their potential to being employed, and companies and employers take advantage of that. So I just want to answer real quick with that piece.
Thank you. We'll go Michelle. Mike, you wanna?
Yeah, no, I think exactly what you said, right? When you sort of create, because of this exploitative system, you've basically created like a lower or a second class of workers, right? And that's going to completely undercut the standards that unions are already fighting for. We've seen that in so many industries. I mean, whether it's, all the trades where we've got prevailing wage for a lot of things, especially here in New York. And then you've got folks, if you've got like a felony record, you've got these companies coming up being like, oh, well, it's okay if you have a record, we'll give you a job. It's going to pay half of what prevailing wage is and won't give you any benefits, but sure, here's how you just completely undercut the standards that labor has been fighting for. So, I mean, I think, yes, that is definitely, it would be a benefit. But I think one of the things that I just kind of wanted to bring in, and I think we touched on this a little bit, the carceral state can't be a substitute for a jobs program overall, right? Whether it's for folks working there or for people who are incarcerated, or we cannot look at the carceral state as what would be our state, federal, municipal jobs program. That shouldn't be it. If we need a jobs program and need to give people good paying jobs, and let's create that. But let's not say incarceration is our jobs program. I think that is just something that will eat our communities alive, under our noses and ostensibly with our consent. And we've been watching that happen. So just wanted to kind of put that in there. I think that's why this conversation around just transition, et cetera, is going to be so critical to have.
Thank you, Michelle. Mike, I think you'd like to add something?
Hello. Want me to speak now?
Yeah.
Real quickly, I just want to say that from a labor perspective, like Ferguson, Missouri, it totally interacts with the minority community. Out of those officers, when the incident happened in Ferguson, none of those cops worked in Ferguson, lived in Ferguson. I believe Brooklyn Center up in Minnesota is the same thing. None of the officers, that officer that shot that young man, didn't live in Brooklyn Center. The reason none of the cops live where they police is because the young people, the minority communities in those areas, all negatively impacted by law enforcement in their young ages, in their teenage years, and in their youth. And one of the consequences of that is if you get a ticket and you're age 16 for driving without a license, and it's a $500 ticket, and you don't have the ability to pay for that, it affects your life in the long term from you want interaction with government in a lot of circumstances. So you don't go apply for a police officer's job, you don't go through a background, you don't get the opportunity for any government jobs. It takes you out of that pipeline and out of the opportunity. And that's one of the ways of life for young men and women in a lot of these minority communities. And one of the ways we change the carceral mentality that you're talking about, Andres, is we get young men and women from those communities to work in those communities, and they're going to view the things that are going on in that community with a much different eye than those people coming in that believe that it's us against them, and the only people that matter surviving today is us. It will change that dynamic enormously. But one of the things we've got to do is get over. If between the ages of 18 and 21, instead of going into the military, you do public service in some other form, or clean your record for anything that you did, or not anything, but for a lot of things that you did as a young man or woman, and give you an opportunity to get into law enforcement or in other government jobs, that would be a huge step forward for our minority communities to be able to embrace those opportunities. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll answer very quickly this question. Look, the reason prison labor exists is because capital has an insatiable hunger for cheap labor, and that's just where it ends up, right? I think this issue is it's going to require a lot of work, a lot of organizing. I think most labor unions, this is not even on their radar, as far as I know, because I think, we're dealing with just expansion of capital in the private sector, let alone the prison system. So I find it, just to be very honest, a little bleak for labor unions to engage in this at the present moment. But I think we also have to look at just why this exists, the laws, and who has the right to unionize and who doesn't have the right to unionize. Because I think there could be some solidarity that could be found in this question of who has the right to have the union. Because we know there's a huge sectors who are excluded from the NLRA, right? We know agriculture workers were excluded. So these exclusion of people who are considered workers, I think could lead to a larger discussion. I think that's the way to build solidarity with incarcerated workers who are making meager wages, because we really have to bring the dialogue. What does it mean to be a worker in this country? And I think those discussions are happening. And so perhaps that is one way forward in bringing in folks who are working inside the prisons.
And also, let's remember that this was by design to create a caste system following the end of slavery in the 13th Amendment and the loophole in it. So let's also remember the all the way back in the Constitution, how it pretty much, this is by design in some ways.
So we're out of time. I do want to thank everyone. I think we could go another hour. This is an important topic, and it's an emerging important topic in the criminal justice movement and in the labor movement. So I really want to thank everyone for your participation and your great responses. And I look forward to us working together, continue to work together to really reimagine public safety and address some of the major issues impacting the criminal justice movement today. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.